In this video, we continue Chapter 6, Anatomy and Physiology. We're going to look at the muscular system and the skeletal system, and here's where we need to very much focus on naming some of those major bones in the body and think about the physiology, the function of three types of muscles. For the skeletal system, we can include all 200 bones that we find. Bone is this hard, dense tissue. Typically, we have a protein matrix that gets filled in with mineral deposits. You're probably aware of calcium. That outer region of the bone, the cortex, are those two things. The inner region is a porous tissue called marrow, and in the long bones, that serves the function of helping to develop red blood cells. Bones have varied sizes and shapes depending on their specific function. So long bones in the arms and legs allow for movement of our extremities and movement of our entire body. Flat bones in the skull and pelvis offer protective functions, and then spinal bones don't articulate that much, but they have the function of protecting that part of our central nervous system inside the spinal cord. So where two or more bones join, we have a joint. And remember, when we think about musculoskeletal injuries, ligaments are those structures that hold bones to bones at a joint. They're going to restrict joint movement. There's an extreme to which we can move a particular joint. Think about hyperextending your knee, moving beyond its natural motion. Some joints have no motion at all, such as those in the skull, and others only allow slight movement. We mentioned the only slight articulation we get from the vertebrae of our back. When we think about those particular joints, we can also think structurally. Ball and socket joints allow for three-dimensional movement, such as at our shoulder, and hinged joints only move in one plane, like our knee. Those different types of joints, therefore, have different amounts of stability and different ranges of motion. So let's start at the top. The skull, the first section to consider, is principally composed of the cranium, or the brain case, broad, flat, protective bones on the top and the sides and the back of the skull, such as the frontal bone, the parietal bones, and then the facial bones, such as the maxilla and the mandible that make up those parts of our face. The spinal column is the next major section to consider, and it has the job of protecting the spinal cord, and we have 33 vertebrae there, broken into regions: the cervical vertebrae of the neck, the thoracic vertebrae of the upper back, the lumbar region, and then we have fused vertebrae at the bottom, 5 in the sacrum and 4 in the coccyx. Now sometimes this is asked of us just to remember as OEC technicians, and so here's a mnemonic device that I like, the 7-12-5-5-4. I typically might go to work as a patroller at 7 in the morning. I'll eat lunch at noon, make my way home at 5 o'clock. The 5 and the 4 I haven't come up with a way to remember yet, but 7-12-5-5-4, 33 total bones. In the thorax, we have 12 pairs of ribs, which are joined to the broad, flat sternum at the front, providing structure and protective function to the heart and the lungs inside. 10 of those pairs are attached to the sternum, and then 2 pairs are floating ribs at the bottom. The pelvis has 3 sets of paired bones, paired meaning there's a left side and a right side. We have the ilium, the pubis, and the ischium, working kind of from top to bottom. Now, an important landmark is the top of the ilium, the top of your hip bone, and we call that the iliac crest, the crest of the ilium. It's an important landmark. It helps us find or understand where the umbilicus would be if we need to assess an abdomen. It becomes a landmark if we need to apply a pelvic binder in case of a pelvic fracture, and so on. The pelvis is that rigid structure, it's circular, and it's going to protect the internal reproductive organs in a female and protect the bladder too. The upper extremities include everything from the clavicle all the way to the fingers. So we have the broad flat scapula in the back, the upper arm bone of the humerus, the two bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna, and then all of the smaller bones in the wrist and the hand. Lower extremities have somewhat of a parallel structure. We have a ball and socket joint at the top. We have that long upper leg bone, the femur, analogous to the humerus in the arm. We have two bones in the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula, analogous to the radius and ulna of the forearm. And then where we have carpal and metacarpals in the wrist and hand, in the foot, there are tarsals and metatarsals. Don't forget we have a patella as well, protecting the knee joint. The primary function of the skeleton is to give structure to the body. It also has those functions of being a repository for calcium and producing red blood cells and white blood cells as well. That protective structure is very apparent with those broad flat bones of the skull, the thorax and the strong structure of the sternum at the front, and the broad bones of the pelvis. Moving to the muscular system, we can combine that with the skeletal system for movement. So three types of muscles. This is a key objective. Skeletal muscles have long, straight fibers that can contract and allow for movement. We have smooth muscles that we find for automatic body functions. Think of the muscular wall of the intestine. And then the cardiac muscles incorporate elements of both of those other ones so that the heart can function as a pump. Skeletal muscles respond to impulses from the voluntary nervous system. And so we get movement of our body as a result. Now, we contrast a tendon with a ligament. A ligament joins bone to bone. A tendon connects muscle to bone. And so when a muscle contracts, that tendon can work on the rigid structure of the skeletal bone it's attached to and provide for movement. Skeletal muscle cells, those straight, long muscle cells, are packed closely together in bundles and bound together by connective tissues, principally a protein called myosin. When each individual cell contracts together, the entire muscle becomes shorter. Think about it. If one cell becomes shorter and its adjacent cell becomes shorter and its adjacent cell becomes shorter, the entire muscle will contract as well. We get flexion due to shortening of a muscle on one side of a structure, and extension when the paired muscle on the opposite side shortens and contracts. Moving to smooth muscles, we find those principally in those involuntary areas of movement. So organs of the digestive tract are a good example. And when they contract, they can help to squeeze and move either food or waste products, for example, through the intestines. Cardiac muscle is only found in the walls of the heart. It combines properties of both, and its additional unique property is it generates its own electrical impulses independent of some input from the peripheral nervous system. That contraction of the cardiac muscle allows the heart to serve as a pump. Muscular and skeletal systems work together to provide our body with shape and movement. Now, in addition to what we consider skeletally and that skeletal muscle, don't forget the function of smooth muscle and the function of cardiac muscle also.